The men came back from the valley carrying fruit so heavy it took 2 of them to bear it on a pole. Dust clung to their sandals. Heat shimmered over the camp. Behind them was Canaan, the land they had been sent to inspect. In front of them were the people waiting to hear whether the promise was real. The fruit said yes. The men said something else. They had seen walled cities. They had seen fortified places sitting high on the hills. They had seen fields, vineyards, and towns that looked less like a wilderness and more like a kingdom already occupied. And then they spoke of the people. Not just strong people, not just soldiers, not just men with weapons and walls. They said the land was filled with people of astonishing size. The Anakim were there, the descendants of the giants. The old names that belonged to the edge of memory. Then came the line that made the whole camp go still. We looked like grasshoppers to ourselves. That is a strange way to describe fear. It does not only say the enemy was large. It says the fear changed the way the scouts saw their own bodies. They had entered the land as men. They came back feeling like insects. In the story, that report almost breaks the people. It turns a destination into a threat. It turns a promise into a wall. It turns a journey into 40 years of wandering. Because giants are never only about height. They are about scale. They are about the feeling that something older than you is standing in the path. They are about the suspicion that the past was not smaller and simpler, but larger, stranger, and closer to the gods. The Bible has more than one of these shadows. Genesis says the Nephilim were on the earth before the flood, and also afterward. Deuteronomy remembers Og of Bashan, last of the Rephaim, by the size of his iron bed. Samuel gives us Goliath of Gath, stepping out between 2 armies with bronze armor and a spear like a weaver's beam. These are not quiet details. They are written like memories that refuse to die. A bed, a spear, a battlefield, a report from frightened scouts. And once you notice the pattern, it does not stay inside one tradition. Across the ancient world, older beings rise above ordinary men. Titans fight gods. Cyclopes hammer thunder. 100-handed giants shake the edge of creation. Gilgamesh walks through Mesopotamian epic as a king too strong for normal life, pushing into forests guarded by monstrous powers. Then the same pattern appears in another place, much later, under a different sky. A farmer opens a mound. A local doctor measures bones. A newspaper prints a headline. Another skeleton has been found, they say. 7 feet, 9 feet, 12 feet. A lost race. A buried people. The ancient giants of America. The story moves from scripture to myth, from myth to dirt, from dirt to museum basements, and from museum basements to the internet. And every time the evidence gets thin, the story gets larger.
This is Unexplained History. I'm Tom Mackenzie. Today, we're going into one of the oldest rabbit holes in human culture, giants. Not just Goliath, not just the Nephilim, not just one strange newspaper clipping about oversized bones in a forgotten mound. We're following the whole chain: the Bible, ancient civilizations, Native American traditions, 19th-century mound reports, and the modern claim that the Smithsonian buried the proof. And I want to be clear about the promise of this episode. We are going to let the mystery breathe first, because the giant story is powerful for a reason. But by the end, the question will change. It will not only be, did giants walk the earth? It will be, why do we keep needing them to?
The oldest giant stories do not feel like one story. They feel like fragments from a broken map. One fragment is in Genesis. The text says that when humankind began to multiply, the divine beings saw the daughters of humans and took wives from among them. Then comes the line that has launched centuries of argument. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. The passage is short. It does not explain as much as we want it to. It gives us a glimpse and then closes the door. But the glimpse is enough. The Nephilim are described as heroes of old, men of renown. That phrase matters. It does not sound like ordinary criminals. It does not sound like a tribe with a border and a census. It sounds like the old heroic age, the time when people imagined the boundary between heaven and earth was thinner. Then, much later in the biblical story, the scouts come back from Canaan and use that same old terror to describe what they saw. They do not merely say the land has tall people. They say they saw the Nephilim there. They say the Anakites come from the Nephilim. They reach back to the oldest name they have for beings too large to fit inside normal history. That is how fear works. It borrows from memory. Then there is Og. Og of Bashan does not enter the story as a monster in a cave. He enters as a king. He rules territory. He has cities. He commands people. But Deuteronomy remembers him by one object: his bed. Only Og, the text says, was left of the remaining Rephaim. His bedstead was an iron bedstead. It was kept in Rabbah of the Ammonites. It was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. That detail changes the atmosphere. A giant in a story can drift into metaphor. A giant with a bed feels different. A bed has weight. It takes up space. It sits somewhere. You can imagine someone pointing to it and saying, "There." That was his. 9 cubits is enormous. Depending on how a cubit is understood, the bed could be more than 13 feet long. The text does not say Og himself was exactly that tall. Beds can be ceremonial. Royal objects can be oversized. Memory can turn a king into something larger than a man. But that is precisely why the object is powerful. It lives between artifact and legend. You can almost see it in a dim room, iron dark with age, too long for any ordinary body. A child asks why it is there. An elder answers with a king's name: Og, last of the Rephaim. The biblical giant tradition keeps doing this. It gives the listener physical anchors. Goliath comes with gear. The story gives him a bronze helmet, a coat of scale armor, greaves for his legs, and a spear shaft compared to a weaver's beam. It makes him visible one object at a time, until the listener can feel why an army would hesitate. He is not only tall, he is bronze, armor, and threat given human shape. Then there are other warriors from Gath, men linked to the giant line, men with unusual strength, unusual weapons, unusual bodies. The tradition gives us names and fragments, not a neat encyclopedia. That is part of its pull. If the Bible gave one clean answer, the mystery might be smaller. Instead, it gives us a scattered field of clues. Nephilim before the flood. Anakim in the land. Rephaim remembered through Og. Goliath between the armies. A bed in Rabbah. A spear like a beam. A camp full of men suddenly feeling like grasshoppers. For believers, this is not random. It is continuity. The old beings survived. Their bloodlines remained. Their names changed, but the pattern stayed. And for anyone listening with one foot inside the mystery, the question becomes hard to shake. Why would ancient writers preserve all these details if there was nothing behind them?
That's the part I find so compelling at the beginning of this story. The giant tradition is not just one verse that people inflated later. It has objects. It has locations. It has names that repeat like half-buried stones. And if you already believe the ancient world was stranger than we admit, those details feel like a trail. A bed here, a spear there, a terrified reconnaissance report over there. But the trail does not stop in the Bible. It runs straight into the myths of other civilizations, where giants are not just enemies of men. They are enemies of the gods.
In the Greek imagination, the world begins with a family fight so large it becomes geography. Earth and sky produce children who are too powerful, too strange, too dangerous to fit inside the order that will come later. The Titans are older than the Olympians. The Cyclopes are one-eyed craftsmen of divine weapons. The Hecaton Kyries have 100 hands and 50 heads. The Gigantes rise in a war against the gods themselves. These are not simply big men. They are the old world pushing back. The stories are vivid because they make civilization feel fragile. Zeus does not inherit a peaceful throne. He wins a universe. The gods do not sit comfortably above the clouds until the older powers have been buried, chained, hurled down, or folded into the new order. That is one of the deep functions of giant stories. They explain why the world feels built on top of something else. Mountains become bodies. Earthquakes become buried rage. Strange stones and old ruins become traces of a prior age. The landscape itself begins to look like a battlefield where the victors moved on and the defeated remained underfoot. The Gigantomachy, the War of Gods and Giants, is not a newspaper report. It is myth. But myth does not mean meaningless. Myth can preserve a pattern of thought with incredible precision. There was an earlier age. The earlier age was larger. The present world exists because the larger beings were defeated. You can find that rhythm again and again. In Greek stories, the new gods rise after cosmic violence. In Mesopotamian stories, kings and heroes stand closer to divine scale than ordinary people do. In other traditions, the first beings are larger, longer-lived, more dangerous, or more intimate with the sacred. The past is not imagined as primitive. It is imagined as huge. That matters, because modern people often assume ancient stories are trying to do bad science. We ask whether the giant was exactly 12 feet tall, whether the bone can be measured, whether the grave can be located. Those are fair questions when someone claims physical proof. But ancient giant stories often work at another level. They describe scale before measurement. They turn awe into bodies. A storm is not only weather, it is a weapon forged by the Cyclopes. A mountain is not only stone, it may be the mark of something thrown down in the war before history. A ruin is not only abandoned architecture, it may be the last visible edge of a people too large for the present world. This is why giants can migrate so easily between religion, myth, and archaeology. They are already built to explain what feels too large. A wall, too old. A mound, too wide. A stone, too heavy. A valley, too full of bones. The believer's version of the argument goes like this. Separate cultures remembered the same thing because they inherited fragments of the same prehistoric truth. The names changed. The gods changed. The geography changed. But the memory remained. Nephilim, Titans, Gigantes, Rephium, stone giants, lost races, men of renown. Different words for the same impossible ancestors. It is an intoxicating idea because it turns mythology into a global witness stand. Every culture becomes a partial testimony. Every monster becomes a memory. Every giant killer becomes a survivor of a war that official history forgot. And that idea only gets stronger when we move east, into one of the oldest epics ever written. There, the giant story is not only about enemies, it is about kings. Gilgamesh stands at the edge of history like a man drawn in a larger scale than everyone around him. He is king of Uruk. He is remembered in Sumerian poems and in the later Akkadian epic. He builds walls. He oppresses his people. He wrestles the wild man Enkidu. He enters the cedar forest. He faces Huwawa, also known as Humbaba, the terrifying guardian of a sacred place. Gilgamesh is not usually presented as a giant in the same simple way as Goliath. But he belongs in this story because ancient size is not always measured from heel to crown. Sometimes it is measured by force. Gilgamesh is too much, too strong, too hungry for fame, too close to the gods. His body and will exceed the limits of normal kingship. The world around him is the same way. The cedar forest is not just timberland, it is a boundary. Uwawa is not just an enemy. He is a monstrous guardian whose presence makes the expedition feel like a trespass into an older order. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu go there, they are not merely hunting glory. They are cutting into a sacred landscape. Again, the pattern returns. The old world is large. The hero enters it. The monster falls. Something magnificent is gained, and something sacred is damaged. That rhythm matters because it shows how giant traditions can hold two emotions at once. They make us want the hero to win. They also make us feel the cost of victory. Goliath falls and Israel is delivered. The Titans fall and the Olympian order rises. Huwawa falls and Gilgamesh becomes greater, but the forest is wounded. In these stories, giants and giant-like beings guard thresholds. They stand between eras. They are not just large bodies in the road. They are the roadblock between one age and another. That is why the giant theory keeps pulling people in. If giants existed, then history has a threshold we have not crossed, honestly. There was another age. There were other powers. Someone won, someone lost, and the official story begins after the bodies were buried. The modern version of that suspicion does not usually begin in a temple or a royal library. It begins with dirt. It begins with someone digging where they were not supposed to dig, or where they did not yet know how to dig carefully. A shovel bites into a mound. A skull rolls loose. A femur is lifted into daylight. Men stand around it and make guesses. Someone says the bones are unusually large. Someone else says no ordinary human could have been that size. Then the local newspaper arrives. By the next morning, a giant has been found.
This is where the story changes texture. Ancient myth can be waved away by some people as symbolism. Scripture can be argued over forever. But a bone in the ground feels different. A bone feels like a receipt. And in 19th century America, that is exactly how these reports were treated. Mounds were opened. Skeletons were measured. Headlines were printed. The giant story became physical. At least, that is how it felt. Because once a mystery moves into newspapers, it also moves into a machine that knows how to make every story taller.
Picture a field in the 19th century American Midwest. The mound rises from the land like a low, deliberate hill. It does not look accidental. Its shape is too clean. Its placement feels chosen. People have passed it for years and wondered who made it. The farmer wants the land cleared. The local antiquarian wants a discovery. The town doctor wants to see what is inside. The newspaper editor wants a story that will travel. They cut into the earth. The work is rough by modern standards. There is no careful grid. No controlled soil samples. No chain of custody that would satisfy a museum today. There are shovels, lanterns, curiosity, and the pressure of men who already have a theory waiting for the dirt to confirm it. Then they find bones. A headline appears. Giant skeleton discovered. One report would describe a jaw too large for any living man. Another would claim a femur measured against the town's tallest resident. Another would say the bones were packed up, shipped away, and never seen again. The article might be only a few inches long. It might sit beside crop prices, church notices, and a report from the county fair. but the language does not need much room to work. A skull is said to be thick. A jawbone is described as massive. The skeleton is said to be extended in a way no ordinary grave should allow. Someone remembers an old story from the same hill. Another witness says the place always felt forbidden. That is enough for the imagination to start building. The mound is no longer a mound. It is a sealed chamber. The bones are no longer human remains. They are a message. The men standing around the trench are no longer neighbors with shovels. They become witnesses at the edge of forbidden history. And because the remains are usually not preserved in a way we can examine now, the story stays perfectly suspended. It has just enough physical detail to feel real, and just enough missing evidence to feel suppressed. Sometimes the report says 7 feet, sometimes 9, sometimes 12. In the most extravagant versions, the numbers become almost impossible, but that does not slow the story. It helps it. A normal skeleton is a local notice. A giant skeleton is a national mystery. This is why the old clippings still circulate today. They have the rhythm of eyewitness testimony without the burden of a surviving case file. They name towns. They mention mounds. They quote respectable-sounding men. They give measurements precise enough to impress a reader, but rarely enough context to test them. For a modern giant hunter, that is not a weakness. It is part of the atmosphere. The clipping feels like a scrap torn from a larger record, and the missing record becomes the shadow that makes the scrap glow. These reports appear again and again across the 19th century. Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, New York, Wisconsin, Iowa. The details change, but the shape stays familiar. A mound, a grave, oversized bones, a quick measurement, a lost race, and then the remains vanish into private hands. A local collection, a museum drawer, or no documented location at all. For believers, that repetition is the point. How many reports does it take before coincidence becomes pattern? How many farmers have to dig up unusually large bones before the official story begins to crack? How many local doctors, sheriffs, professors, and editors have to put their names beside these discoveries before we admit something strange was happening under American soil? The rabbit hole deepens because the mound itself already feels mysterious. North America is covered with earthworks, burial mounds, platform mounds, effigy mounds, geometric enclosures, serpents, circles, squares, ridges, and sacred landscapes shaped over centuries by indigenous communities. To many outsiders arriving with a thin version of American history, the mounds felt too old and too deliberate to fit the story they had been taught. Who built them? How old were they? Why were they aligned, shaped, layered, filled with burials and objects and memory? And once people decided the mounds felt too impressive for the history they had inherited, another possibility began to spread. Maybe the builders had vanished. Maybe they had been unlike anyone still living. Maybe they had been giants. The mound became a doorway. The newspaper became a trumpet. The missing bones became an invitation. Because if the skeletons were real, and if they kept disappearing, then another question began to form. Where did they go?
This is where the story gets dangerous in the best documentary sense. Not because we have proved anything yet. We have not. But because the pattern starts to feel cumulative. Scripture gives you giant names. Myth gives you giant wars. America gives you mounds, bones, clippings, and missing evidence. And when those pieces line up in the mind, they make one very tempting question. What if the old stories were not just stories?
The lost race theory did not arrive all at once. It formed slowly, like fog gathering over a field. First, there were the mounds, thousands of them, scattered across the eastern woodlands and beyond. Many were low and rounded. Others rose into platforms or took the shape of animals. Some belonged to larger ceremonial landscapes, with circles, squares, avenues, ridges, and alignments that suggested planning over long periods of time. Then came the question that haunted early observers. Who could have built all this? For people already primed by biblical history, ancient migration theories, and newspaper marvels, the answer did not have to stay local. It could reach across the ocean. It could reach into Genesis. It could reach into Atlantis, lost tribes, wandering peoples, or an older civilization whose traces had been left under American soil. The theory was flexible because it needed to be. In one version, the builders were a vanished, civilized race. In another, they were linked to the peoples of the Bible. In another, they were survivors from a drowned world. In another, they were not merely culturally advanced, but physically enormous. The giant version had special power. A giant race could explain the scale of the earthworks. A giant race could explain the oversized bones reported in local papers. A giant race could connect America to the Nephilim, to Goliath, to the Titans, to the old idea that the earliest age of the world had been larger than the present one. That is why the theory did not feel like one claim. It felt like a map. A mound was no longer only an earthwork. It was a marker. A skeleton was no longer only a burial. It was a survivor of the old bloodline. A native story about dangerous beings was no longer only a story inside a particular culture. To outside interpreters, it became another scrap of testimony. The old world seemed to be speaking from too many directions to ignore. And if the lost race had vanished, the disappearance itself made the theory stronger. It gave the story a tragedy. It suggested a war before history, a conquest before memory. A people whose monuments survived after their bodies were scattered. The believer's imagination could fill in the missing pages. Maybe the giants ruled the valleys. Maybe smaller peoples rose against them. Maybe the mounds were tombs, fortresses, temples, or warnings. Maybe the old stories of giant killers, stone beings, cannibals, and monster races were not separate traditions at all, but broken memories of the same ancient conflict. This is the part of the mystery that has to be felt before it is judged. Because the theory is not persuasive only because of evidence. It is persuasive because of structure. It turns scattered details into a story with beginning, middle, and disappearance. It gives the continent a secret prehistory. It makes the ground feel charged. And every time the evidence gets thin, the story gets larger. If the measurements are inconsistent, that means the reports were scattered and suppressed. If the bones cannot be found, that means someone took them. If scholars reject the lost race, that means the gatekeepers are afraid of what the lost race would prove. The thinner the proof becomes, the more room the story has to grow. The theory is already learning how to survive. But before it becomes a full-blown cover-up story, it needs one more ingredient. It needs living traditions that seem to remember giants. Across native traditions, there are stories of beings larger, older, stranger, and more dangerous than ordinary people. Some are stone-coated. Others are remembered as cannibal beings, monsters at the edge of the known world, enemies, warnings, or powers tied to winter storytelling, ceremonial knowledge, moral teaching, and the deep memory of a specific place. To hear those stories carefully, you have to hear them as their own stories. But that is not how the giant theory usually uses them. The giant hunter hears one word first: giant. After that, the rest begins to line up. The Bible has Nephilim. Greece has titans and gigantes. Mesopotamia has superhuman kings and monstrous guardians. North America has mounds, old newspaper claims, and native traditions of powerful beings who are not like ordinary humans. Suddenly, every old story becomes one story. A mound becomes a grave marker. A missing bone becomes suspicious. A museum becomes a vault, and a skeptical archaeologist becomes a gatekeeper. By the time the Smithsonian enters the legend, the audience has been prepared for it. There must be proof somewhere. If we do not have it, someone must have taken it. If someone took it, the taker must be powerful. And in the American imagination, few places are more perfect for that role than a national museum. A museum has basements. It has drawers. It has labels most people never read. It has bones, boxes, field notes, locked doors, and the authority to decide what counts as history. As villains go, the Smithsonian was almost too perfect. It is national. It is old. It is trusted by schools and tourists. It holds the official past behind glass. It has the aura of science and the architecture of secrecy. If a giant race had been hidden, believers ask, where else would the evidence go? You can picture the story without trying very hard. A wagon arrives with crates. Inside are bones too long for any ordinary coffin. A curator signs a ledger. The crates move down a corridor. A door closes. Years pass. The public sees arrowheads, pottery, baskets, and reconstructed villages, but never the skulls that would change everything. The missing bones become the proof of the missing bones. That is the peak of the mystery. The theory now has ancient texts, mythic parallels, mound reports, native giant traditions, and an institution large enough to hide the final evidence. It feels complete. A forbidden race. A national cover-up. A truth too large for the official timeline.
If you stop the story right there, I understand why people believe it. I really do. Because it has the shape of a great mystery The evidence is scattered, but the pattern is seductive. The bones are missing, but that makes the room feel darker. The museum is silent, but silence can sound like guilt when you already suspect a secret. And that is exactly why the next part matters. Because the question is not just whether the story is exciting. The question is whether it survives contact with the records.
Cyrus Thomas was not hunting a forbidden history headline. He was a 19th century investigator working in a world where the mound-builder question still had cultural force. Who built the mounds? Were they the ancestors of native peoples or the remains of a vanished civilization? Thomas worked with the Bureau of Ethnology, connected to the Smithsonian Institution. He and others examined mounds, artifacts, burial contexts, and reports across large parts of the eastern United States. And here, the floor drops. The investigation did not reveal a hidden giant race. It helped show that the mounds were native-built. The institution that later conspiracy stories accuse of hiding the proof of giants was tied to work that helped dismantle the lost race theory. That does not solve every question. It does not make every old newspaper clipping vanish. It does not mean 19th century science was pure or modern museum history was harmless. It means the central direction of the evidence was not what the giant legend needed it to be. The first crack is documentation. Many giant skeleton reports simply do not have what a serious claim needs. There is no surviving skeleton, no reliable chain of custody, no professional measurement, no clear excavation context. A claim that sounds dramatic in a newspaper becomes much smaller when you ask where the bones are, who measured them, how they were measured, and whether anyone trained in anatomy examined them. The second crack is anatomy. Human remains are easy to misread when they are fragmentary. A femur can be guessed too long. A skeleton can be reconstructed from bones that do not belong together. Soil pressure can distort a burial. A skull seen in isolation can look enormous. Very tall individuals exist, and their remains can inspire stories without proving a separate race. Even honest observers can be fooled by expectation. If a town has heard for years that the old mound contains giants, then every large bone arrives inside that expectation. The measuring tape is not the only tool in the trench. So is the story everyone brought with them. The third crack is fossils. Ancient people and early settlers found enormous bones, but not all enormous bones are human. Mammoths, mastodons, and other large animals left remains that could be mistaken for giants, especially before comparative anatomy was widely understood. The fourth crack is the newspaper machine. 19th century papers loved marvels. A strange discovery sold copies. A local exaggeration could be reprinted elsewhere, stripped of caution, and made taller each time it traveled. By the time a report crossed the country, a tall skeleton could become a 9-foot giant, then a 12-foot giant, then proof of a lost civilization. That does not mean every editor was lying. A rumor can travel because people believe it. A mistake can harden because it sounds better than the correction. A number can survive because nobody has the bones anymore and nobody wants the smaller version of the story. The machine did not have to invent wonder from nothing. It only had to stretch it. The fifth crack is the missing drawer. When a claim depends on a bone that cannot be examined, the story can remain thrilling forever. But science cannot measure a rumor. It cannot date a vanished femur. It cannot identify a skeleton that exists only in a clipping. At some point, the empty drawer stops being a clue and becomes the limit of the claim. None of those cracks erase the power of the old stories. They do change what kind of evidence we have. Scripture, myth, oral tradition, local memory, and newspaper reports are not worthless. They are windows into what people feared, valued, exaggerated, protected, and misunderstood. But they are not the same as a documented race of enormous humans.
A normal debunk would probably stop there. Bad measurements, missing bones, newspaper exaggeration, no chain of custody. Case closed. But this story has another layer, because once the giant race disappears, we have to ask why so many people needed it to be there in the first place.
And now, the harder truth arrives. The lost race theory did not begin as harmless curiosity. The mounds were admired. Native people were dismissed. So the builders had to be someone else. That was the moral engine hidden inside the mystery. If a lost race built the mounds, then native people could be treated as latecomers, inheritors, destroyers, or squatters on someone else's greatness. The ancient landscape could be admired without giving living indigenous communities the dignity of authorship. Giants made that move feel almost spiritual. They did not merely replace native builders with another human group. They replaced them with a superhuman group. The monuments became too large for ordinary history. The builders became too large for ordinary bodies. Who gets smaller when we make the giants bigger? That is the question the theory avoids. The modern Smithsonian giant story is built like a locked room mystery, where the locked room is the whole point. The claim usually goes like this. For decades, giant skeletons were found across America. Many were sent to museums. The Smithsonian took possession of the most important remains. Then, to protect the official version of history, the institution destroyed the bones, hid the documents, or sealed the evidence away. Sometimes, the story adds court orders. Sometimes it adds whistleblowers. Sometimes it claims a major admission was forced into public view. In viral versions, the details often trace back to unreliable or satirical sources, then get copied into posts that look serious because the subject already feels serious. The power of the story is not in its paperwork. It is in its architecture. It gives believers an answer to the hardest question. If giants were real, where are the bones? They were hidden. That answer is emotionally satisfying because it transforms absence into evidence. A missing skeleton no longer weakens the theory. It strengthens the suspicion. Every empty drawer becomes a clue. Every museum denial becomes part of the cover-up. Every request for documentation becomes proof that official history is nervous. This is how a story becomes self-sealing. If a bone exists, it proves giants. If a bone does not exist, it proves suppression. If an expert doubts the claim, the expert is protecting the system. If a fact check traces the story to a false source, the fact check becomes part of the same system. The theory can no longer lose because it has changed the rules of evidence. And yet, underneath the fantasy version, there is a real history of museums, remains, and power. That is why the story sticks. Museums really did collect human remains. Institutions really did remove ancestors from graves. Native communities really did have sacred objects and burial materials taken, studied, displayed, or stored without consent. There really are locked rooms and archives most people never see. The false claim borrows emotional force from a real wound. Then it points that force in the wrong direction. Instead of asking how indigenous ancestors were treated, it asks whether those ancestors were secretly giants. Instead of asking how native achievement was denied, it invents an even older race and gives the monuments to them. Instead of facing the ordinary violence of collection, it imagines an extraordinary plot to hide forbidden anatomy. The result is a story that feels rebellious while repeating an older erasure. It says, "Do not trust the official version." That instinct can be healthy. History is full of institutions that hid, distorted, or minimized uncomfortable truths. But suspicion is not a substitute for care. If suspicion makes us ignore better evidence, it becomes another kind of blindness. If suspicion makes us take monuments away from the people who built them, it becomes part of the old wound. The real cover-up was not that giants were hidden. The real cover-up was that native achievement was made to look impossible. The giant theory wants the past to be bigger than we were told. In one sense, it is right. The past is bigger. The mounds are bigger. The indigenous histories behind them are bigger. The engineering, ceremony, trade, astronomy, burial practice, and political life of mound-building cultures are bigger than the shallow version many Americans inherited. But the past does not become bigger by replacing those people with giants. It becomes smaller. A giant race is actually the easy answer. It turns human achievement into a special effect. It makes monuments impressive because the builders were not like us, not like the people whose descendants still live, remember, and fight for their ancestors. The harder answer is also the more wondrous one. Human communities built these places. Human hands carried the earth. Human beings shaped the ridges, raised the platforms, buried their dead, aligned their spaces, and returned to those landscapes with memory and purpose. Think about what that means without shrinking it. It means baskets of soil moved again and again until a shape rose where no shape had been. It means paths worn by feet, fires tended through seasons, elders teaching where to place the next layer, children growing up beside works their grandparents had begun. It means a landscape made slowly enough to become memory before it was finished. It also means that the most astonishing part of the story was never hidden. It was standing in open air, misnamed by people who could not imagine its makers. The mystery was not too little evidence. The mystery was a refusal to see what the evidence was already saying. That is not a smaller story than giants. It is larger because it does not ask us to imagine a vanished super race. It asks us to look at human beings clearly. No giant is needed to make that astonishing. Return to the mound at dusk. The field is quiet now. The old excavation trench has softened. Grass covers the scars. The earthwork rises with a patience that makes the modern road nearby feel temporary. There is no giant skull in the grass. No iron bed under glass. No forbidden skeleton waiting in a drawer to overturn the world. There is only earth shaped by hands. That should already be more than enough. But human beings have always struggled with enough. We want the sealed chamber. We want the forbidden bone. We want the single discovery that makes every old story line up at once. A giant skeleton in a museum drawer would be simple. It would give the mystery a body and give the believer a victory. Human history rarely gives us simple gifts like that. What it gives instead is a harder kind of awe. Communities move in soil basket by basket. Ceremonial landscapes built over generations. Ancestors buried with care. Stories that do not belong to outsiders. Monuments that later people turn into evidence for someone else. We stand before old things and feel small. Then we invent beings large enough to explain the feeling. The scouts came back from Canaan and said they felt like grasshoppers. Maybe that is the most honest sentence in the entire giant tradition. It does not begin with a measurement. It begins with the sensation of being reduced. Small before the land. Afraid of the enemy. Overwhelmed by the past. Reduced by the possibility that the world is older, stranger, and more crowded than we thought. Giants give that feeling a body. At times, the body is sacred. In another setting, it is mythic. It may be a warrior across a valley, a monster in a forest, a headline in a county paper, or a rumor about a museum basement. The body changes, the feeling remains. And that is why the giant story will not die. It gives believers a hidden history. It gives skeptics a puzzle to solve. It gives storytellers scale. It gives frightened people an enemy large enough to match their fear. But the ending of this episode is not that wonder must be abandoned. The ending is that wonder has to be returned to the right place. The Bible's giant traditions still matter because they show how ancient people imagined terror, power, memory, and the age before the world they knew. Greek giants still matter because they show a civilization picturing order as something won from chaos. Gilgamesh still matters because he shows the human hunger to become larger than death. Native stories still matter because they belong to living cultures with their own meanings, teachings, and responsibilities. And the mounds matter because they are not failed evidence for giants. They are successful evidence for people. They organized labor across generations. They understood landforms, soil, ceremony, trade, and memory. They built in earth because earth was not lesser than stone. Their works were so impressive that outsiders looked at them and decided ordinary native history could not explain them. That was the real failure of imagination. Not refusing to believe in giants. Refusing to believe in human beings.
There's a line I keep coming back to in this story. We looked like grasshoppers to ourselves. That may be the whole thing. The giant is what we create when we cannot bear our own smallness. Sometimes that creation becomes myth, and myth can be beautiful. Sometimes it becomes theology, And theology can be powerful. Sometimes it becomes folklore, and folklore can carry a people's memory. But sometimes it becomes theft. Sometimes we make giants because we would rather imagine a lost super race than admit that the people we pushed aside built something magnificent. And once you see that, the Smithsonian legend looks different. It is not only a claim about bones. It is a story about who gets to own wonder. If the proof is hidden in a museum, then believers can keep waiting for the day history is handed back to them. But if the wonder is already visible in the mounds, then the responsibility changes. We do not need a revelation. We need respect. That does not make the past less mysterious. It makes it more demanding. Because if the mounds were made by human hands, then the wonder is not locked in a Smithsonian basement. It is still out there, in the earth, in the shape of the land, in the communities whose histories were never as small as the story told about them. The bones they told us were buried may not prove giants, but the stories prove something. They prove that we are still haunted by size, by old powers, by buried things, by the fear that history is larger than the version we inherited. And maybe it is. Just not in the way the giant hunters hoped.
The sun drops lower over the mound. For a moment, the whole shape turns dark against the sky. It could be a hill. It could be a grave. It could be a sleeping body if you wanted badly enough to see one. Then the light changes. The illusion passes. What remains is earth. Not empty earth. Not ordinary earth. Earth carried basket by basket, generation by generation, by people whose names were not preserved in the newspaper stories about giants. That is the final turn. The past was larger than we were told, but its giants were human.